Our story unfolds in Alexandria, in the last years of the Ptolemaic kingdom. It is the year 48 before the Common Era. In the royal palace on the harbour's edge, Cleopatra VII has just been driven from her throne by the ministers of her younger brother. She will soon return, carried in secret through the harbour mouth, past the great lighthouse on the island of Pharos, its fire burning at the entrance to what was among the greatest cities of the Hellenistic world. Alexandria already holds more than 500,000 souls. Its streets run straight as arrows, its library holds the collected learning of centuries, and its ships carry Egyptian grain to feed the city of Rome. Yet the kingdom is 3 centuries old now, and the shadow of Rome falls longer each year across the harbour. You are standing at the bow of a merchant vessel as the coast of Egypt resolves itself from the violet haze of late afternoon, and there upon the western horizon rises the Pharos lighthouse with its flame already kindled against the coming dark. The year is 240 BCE, and the city before you is Alexandria, named after Alexander the Great, who founded this place in 331 BCE near an ancient Egyptian settlement that some called Rakotes. The salt smell of the harbour reaches you first, mixing with the scent of dried fish from the processing yards that line the eastern shore, and you feel the cooling breeze from the Mediterranean after the heat of the Egyptian day has begun to release its hold upon the water. Around you, the sailors adjust the rigging without speaking, their movements slow with the fatigue of 70 days at sea from Syracuse. The vessel you stand upon carries Corinthian bronze and Cypriot copper, part of the vast commerce that moves through what was among the largest seaports in Egypt, where a substantial portion of Egyptian foreign trade was handled. You watch as the harbour mouth comes into view, crowded with merchant vessels from across the Mediterranean, their sails furled, and their hulls low in the water with grain from the Nile Delta, or wine from the Aegean Islands, or perhaps the fine glassware, for which the workshops of Alexandria were becoming renowned throughout the Hellenistic world. The slap of waves against limestone quays, polished by centuries of use, reaches your ears now, a steady percussion that has greeted arrivals since Ptolemy II built the city between 285 and 246 BCE, transforming the vision of Alexander into a residence of the Ptolemies. The pale rose light of sunset on the white walls of the new city catches your eye as the grid of streets becomes visible, laid out in what was said to be the Macedonian fashion, straight and broad, avenues reportedly wide enough for 6 chariots to pass abreast, running from east to west and north to south with a precision that suggests architects who may have measured by the stars. You can trace the main thoroughfare from your place on the deck, the street that leads from the Gate of the Sun to the royal quarter that sits on the eastern harbour, its palaces reflecting in the water with their columns and their gardens suspended between the actual and the doubled world. The distant cry of gulls circling the masts of grain ships follows you as your vessel glides past a Libyan freighter being unloaded by torchlight, its cargo of ivory and ostrich feathers destined for the warehouses of the king's own factors. Alexandria, the ancient Greek name, was letter 1F00 lambda epsilon psi alpha nu delta rho epsilon iota alpha Alexandria, and this name would echo across the centuries in the Arabic al-Iskandaria that derives from this Greek name, and in the Coptic names that were letter 2CA3 letter 2, yet 1 letter 2C9 5 letter 2C9F letter 3F Rakoti, and letter 2C8 1 letter 2C9 7 letter 2C8 9 letter 2C9D letter 2, 1 letter 2C9B letter 2C8 7 letter 2CA3 Alexandria, names that carry within them the layered memory of the place where you now approach. The city stretched in its later forms 32 kilometers along the Mediterranean coast, though in this year of 240 BCE it occupies a more modest reach. Yet already ancient Alexandria may have had over 500,000 inhabitants, a figure that staggers the imagination and explains the dense smoke of cooking fires that now begins to rise from the quarter called the Beta, where the mechanics and the artisans make their homes among the workshops and the small temples to foreign gods. You feel the vessel turn beneath your feet as the pilot guides her toward the royal harbour, the more sheltered anchorage reserved for vessels bearing the king's seal or passengers of sufficient distinction to warrant the attention of the harbour master. The city rises from the narrow strip of land between the sea and Lake Merotes, that broad sheet of fresh water that stretches southward to the cultivated lands beyond. And you can see how the engineers of the first Ptolemy have contrived to make advantage of this geography, with canals threading between the harbours and the lake, to bring the produce of Egypt directly to the quays where it will be transferred to seagoing ships. The cooling breeze from the Mediterranean stirs the pennants above the temple of Isis Pharos, that goddess who protects sailors and who shares her sanctuary with the divine memory of the city's founder. Evening falls, and the first lamps appear in the windows of the great houses, pinpricks of yellow against the deepening blue, and you observe how the light multiplies across the surface of the eastern harbour where the royal quarter sits, its palaces reflecting in the water with a fidelity that seems almost deliberate, as though the architects who raised those colonnades and terraces wished to remind every observer that Alexandria was built upon the sea in defiance of nature itself. The salt smell of the harbour grows stronger as you descend to the main deck to prepare for disembarkation, and you notice how the other passengers have gathered at the rail, their faces turned toward the city with expressions of anticipation or exhaustion or the particular awe that comes from beholding a place where the accumulated knowledge of the world has found its repository. The vessel settles against the quay with a gentle shudder, and the slap of waves against limestone quays changes its rhythm, becoming the irregular splash of water against hull as the rowers ship their oars and the lines are thrown to waiting hands on shore. You step onto the gangplank and feel the slight give of the wooden boards beneath your feet, the transition between the unstable world of the ship and the solid ground of the city that Alexander the Great founded in 331 BCE upon the site of the ancient Egyptian settlement Rakotes, a place that has known the tread of armies and the whisper of philosophers and the clink of coins counted in a dozen languages. The customs official who examines your baggage wears the uniform of the royal administration, his Greek spoken with the accent of Macedonia that persists among the military class even 3 generations after the first settlement. He notes your place of origin and your declared purpose in visiting Alexandria, and he stamps your permit with the seal of the Port Authority, that institution which oversees the largest seaport in Egypt, where approximately 80% of Egyptian foreign trade is handled through this port and its associated warehouses. You walk slowly through the gate that separates the quays from the city proper, your footsteps echoing against the paving stones that have been worn smooth by the passage of countless feet before your own. The grid of streets becomes visible in the lamplight, laid out in the Macedonian fashion, straight and broad, and you find yourself upon the Canopic Way, that grand processional avenue that traverses the city from east to west, and that serves as the spine about which all other movement organizes itself. The city stretched in its modern form 32 kilometers along the Mediterranean coast, though you walk only a fraction of that distance tonight, bound for the quarter near the Palace district, where travelers of moderate means may find lodging among the houses of the minor officials, and the scholars attached to the great library that Ptolemy II established between 285 and 247 BCE as part of his completion of the city that Alexander had envisioned. The cooling breeze from the Mediterranean follows you into the streets, carrying with it the sounds of the harbour still, the creak of rigging, and the shouts of stevedores, and the eternal slap of waves against limestone quays polished by 3 centuries of use. You pass a wine shop where men sit at tables beneath an awning that stirs in the wind, their conversation low and their gestures unhurried, and you smell the resinous smoke of pine torches that someone has lit against the gathering dark. The salt smell of the harbour has begun to yield to the more domestic odours of cooking, of bread baking, and of the lentil stews that form the staple of the Alexandrine diet for those who cannot afford the fish that the sea provides in such abundance. The royal quarter sits on the eastern harbour, its palaces reflecting in the water that you glimpse between the buildings as you turn northward along a secondary street, and you understand something of why the Ptolemies chose to make this city their residence. This place that became one of the most important centres of the Hellenistic world, and that would later become the capital of the Roman province of Egyptus, when the legions came to claim what Alexander's successors could no longer hold. The Coptic names were letter 2ca3 letter 2, 81 letter 2c9 5 letter 2c9f letter 3f Rakoti, and letter 2c81 letter 2c9 7 letter 2c89 letter 2c9d letter 2, 81 letter 2c9b letter 2c87 letter 2ca3 Alexandria. Names that preserve the double memory of the Egyptian village and the Greek metropolis, and you feel that doubleness in the architecture around you, in the lotus capitals that crown columns of pure Hellenic proportion, in the obelisks that stand before temples dedicated to gods whose names are spoken in the old tongue of the priests. Evening deepens, and the first lamps appear in the windows of the great houses in greater number now, and the distant cry of gulls circling the masts of grain ships has ceased as the birds settle upon their roosts or seek the open water beyond the breakwaters that protect the harbour. The ancient Greek name was letter 1F00 lambda epsilon psi alpha nu delta rho epsilon iota alpha Alexandria, and you whisper it to yourself as you walk, feeling the shape of the syllables in your mouth, that name which would become the Arabic Alexandria, transformed by centuries of usage, but still recognizable in its essence. You find your lodging in a house owned by a man from Kos, a physician who has settled in Alexandria to study the anatomical texts that the library preserves, and who lets rooms to travellers of respectable appearance. He greets you in the courtyard, where a fountain plays in a basin of Aswan granite, and he offers you water to wash and a couch upon which to rest before the evening meal. The salt smell of the harbour has faded to a distant suggestion here, replaced by the fragrance of jasmine that his gardeners have trained against the walls, and by the clean smell of the water that flows without ceasing from the spout, shaped like a dolphin's head. The physician speaks of his work as you sit together in the courtyard, of the dissections he has witnessed at the temple of Serapis, where the priests of Asclepius have permitted the study of the human form in ways that would be unthinkable in his native island. He mentions the scholars he has met, the names that echo through the halls of the museum, where the best minds of the age gather under royal patronage to argue and to teach, and to add their contributions to the ever-growing collection of knowledge. Alexandria, named after Alexander the Great, who founded this place in 331 BCE upon the ancient Egyptian settlement Rakotis, has become for this man what it has become for so many others, a place of transformation, a city built on the sea that draws to itself the ambitious and the curious and the exiled from every shore of the Mediterranean. The meal is simple, bread and olives, and a wine from the Merotic vineyards that the physician praises for its medicinal properties, and you eat slowly, aware of the fatigue that has accumulated in your limbs during the long approach from the horizon. The cooling breeze from the Mediterranean moves through the courtyard, stirring the surface of the water in the fountain and causing the lamplight to shiver upon the walls. The physician withdraws to his own quarters, and you are left alone in the courtyard with the fountain and the stars that have emerged above the roofline, the constellations of early autumn wheeling in their accustomed courses. The slap of waves against limestone quays reaches you as a murmur from the harbour, and you realize how completely the city is oriented toward the water, how every street and every building ultimately relates itself to the fact of the sea that surrounds it on the northern side, and that enters it in the form of the harbors and the canals. You think of what you have learned of this city's history, how it would decline after the Islamic conquest of Egypt in 641 CE, how large areas were permanently flooded after a severe earthquake in the 8th or 9th century, how by the early 19th century, Alexandria had sunk to a fishing village cut off from the hinterland, its glory forgotten by all but the scholars who read of it in ancient texts. Yet the construction of the Mahmoudiya Canal enabled the city's resurgence as an international trading center, and the Egyptian cotton trade contributed significantly to this resurgence, drawing the world back to a place that had never entirely lost its connection to the commerce of the sea. Underwater archaeological investigations have been conducted in the harbour since 1994, and these investigations yielded new findings about the predecessor settlement Rakotes and the Ptolemaic period, discoveries that continue to reshape our understanding of what this place once was. But such knowledge belongs to a future that you cannot inhabit, and you let it drift from your thoughts like the smoke from the extinguished lamp. The ancient Greek name was letter 1F00 lambda epsilon psi alpha nu delta rho epsilon iota alpha Alexandria, and you speak it once more into the darkness, hearing how the name contains within itself the aspiration toward defense, toward protection, that motivated its founder in the years of his conquest. The first watch of the night has passed when you rise from your couch and make your way to the chamber that has been prepared for you, a small room overlooking the street, where the silence is broken only by the occasional passage of a night watchman or a late reveller making unsteady progress toward home. The grid of streets becomes visible in your mind's eye, laid out in the Macedonian fashion, straight and broad, and you follow those imagined avenues in your half-waking state, tracing the lines that the surveyors drew across the Egyptian landscape with their groma and their measuring rods. The lamps that burned in the windows of the great houses are being extinguished one by one as the householders seek their rest, and the darkness thickens in the spaces between the buildings. The salt smell of the harbour returns to you as you lie upon your bed, a reminder of the world that continues its activity beyond the walls of this house, the unloading of vessels that will proceed through the night, and the preparation of cargoes for departure with the morning tide. The city became one of the most important centers of the Hellenistic world, and you feel something of that importance as a pressure upon your own consciousness, the weight of accumulated achievement that presses upon every visitor who comes with open senses to this place. The Coptic names were letter 2CA3 letter 2, it 1 letter 2C95 letter 2C9F letter 3F Rakoti, and letter 2C81 letter 2C97 letter 2C89 letter 2C9D letter 2C81 letter 2C9B letter 2C87 letter 2CA3 Alexandria. And those names too seem to murmur in the darkness, the voices of populations that have spoken and passed away, leaving only their designations behind them. The cooling breeze from the Mediterranean moves across your face where you lie near the unshuttered window, and you pull the light coverlet higher upon your shoulders. The city served as the residence of the Ptolemies, and in your drowsiness you seem to see them pass before you, the successive kings and queens who made this city the stage upon which their dynasty performed its ambitions and its tragedies. The Arabic name Alexandria derives from this Greek name, and that derivation too seems present in the darkness, a thread of continuity that binds the centuries together in ways that waking thought cannot entirely comprehend. The city was completed under Ptolemy II between 285 and 247 BCE, and you seem to inhabit that completion, to rest within the achievement of architects and laborers whose names have been forgotten, but whose work surrounds you. The harbour mouth comes into view once more in your drifting mind, crowded with merchant vessels from across the Mediterranean, and you are standing again at the bow of your vessel as the coast of Egypt resolves itself from the violet haze. The city was named after Alexander the Great, and that naming too seems present in your awareness, the assertion of identity upon a place that had known other names before and would know others after. The ancient Greek name was letter 1F00 lambda epsilon psi alpha nu delta rho epsilon iota alpha, Alexandria, and the syllables repeat themselves in your mind like a charm against full waking, like a thread that leads through the labyrinth of consciousness toward the center where rest is possible. The salt smell of the harbor, the cooling breeze, the pale rose light that has faded now to the darkness that fills the chamber, and that seems to extend beyond the chamber to the street outside, to the harbor, to the sea itself. You are standing at the bow of a merchant vessel, or you are lying upon a couch in a house near the palace district, or you are nowhere that can be named in the ordinary language of place and time. The lamps have gone out in the last of the great houses. The watchman passes in the street below, his footsteps soft upon the worn paving. The water in the fountain has ceased its play, or perhaps you have ceased to hear it, the distinction between sound and silence having lost its edge in the depths of approaching sleep. Alexandria. The name itself becomes a kind of breathing, a rhythm without content, a sound that carries the weight of centuries and the lightness of a single moment suspended between the day that has ended and the day that has not yet begun. The city built on the sea, the city named for the conqueror. The city that would become and that would pass away and that would become again, in other forms, under other names. The Arabic Alexandria deriving from the Greek that derived from the Macedonian who stood once where you stand now, or where you stood, or where you will stand when the light returns, and the gulls cry once more above the masts of the grain ships. The coverlet is warm. The air moves gently. Somewhere far and near, the sea continues its eternal motion against the quays that men have built to hold it back, to shape it, to make from it a harbor and a home. The night holds you now, as the city holds you, as the past and the future hold you in their indifferent embrace. The stars wheel. The water breathes. The darkness is complete, and in its completeness there is a kind of peace, a kind of return to the element from which all building comes and to which all building in time returns. The night air carries you across the darkened waters of the great harbor, where the island of Pharos rises from the sea like a promise made in stone. You are standing at the rail of a merchant vessel from Rhodes, your cloak pulled close against the Mediterranean chill, your eyes fixed upon a distant point of light that flickers and grows against the black horizon. That small spark is the fire of the Pharos, the first lighthouse ever built by human hands, and it calls across the waves to every ship that dares the passage into Alexandria. The water shifts beneath you in long, slow swells, and somewhere in the darkness a rope creaks against seasoned wood, a sound as old as sailing itself. Around you, other vessels hold their course by this same beacon, their sails dim shapes against a sky where the stars have begun to pale with the approach of a moon not yet risen. The salt spray touches your face with fingers cold and faintly bitter, carrying with it the mineral tang of deep water and the fainter sweetness of harbor mud waiting beyond the breakwaters. You can smell the ship itself, the ancient accumulation of tar and timber, of stored grain and the leather of cargo nets, all of it held in suspension by the moving air. The captain speaks quietly to his helmsman, their voices low enough to seem almost part of the wind, and you feel the vessel respond beneath your feet as the rudder finds a new line. The fire of the Pharos grows larger now, no longer a spark, but a steady orange glow that throws its radiance upward into the low clouds, painting their undersides with color that seems to pulse and breathe with the life of the flame itself. That orange glow of the great fire dancing on the undersides of clouds is the first true sign of civilization after days of empty sea, and something in your chest loosens at the sight, some vigilance you had not known you were keeping. The tower reveals itself gradually, as all great things do, emerging from the night in 3 distinct stages that diminish as they ascend. The lowest is a massive square base, its pale limestone blocks barely visible in the darkness, broad enough to seem almost a fortress rather than a foundation. Above this rises an octagonal middle section, its 8 faces catching the firelight in uneven glimmers, each angle a subtle shift in the geometry of ascent. The topmost cylinder crowns the structure, and from within this highest chamber the fire itself burns, fed and tended through the long hours of darkness by keepers who know nothing of your approach but serve you nonetheless. The Pharos, called letter 1F41, Phi Alpha Rho Omicron Sigma, letter 1F00 Lambda Epsilon Psi Alpha Nu Delta Rho Epsilon Epsilon Sigma, or letter 1F00 Lambda Epsilon Psi Alpha Nu Delta Rho Iota Nu Omicron Sigma, in Greek by those who built it, stands approximately 115 to 160 meters in height, and will remain the tallest lighthouse ever constructed until the 20th century dawns with its steel and electric light. It was the youngest of the 7 wonders of the ancient world, this tower upon the island of Pharos, having replaced the walls of Babylon when those ancient fortifications had decayed in Hellenistic times beyond any hope of continued wonder. Your vessel draws nearer, and now you can hear what before was only suggested by the quality of the light. A deep grinding sound, rhythmic and deliberate, as some mechanism within the tower turns upon its axis. This is the grinding sound of the bronze mirror mechanism turning on its axis, a polished disc of metal that catches the fire and throws it outward across the sea in a beam more concentrated than any open flame could achieve alone. The mirror magnifies and directs, transforming mere burning into navigation, into salvation, into the difference between harbour and shipwreck on this coast, where shoals wait in darkness to claim the unwary. You imagine the keeper who tends this apparatus, his hands perhaps greasy with resin, his face lit from below by the fire he serves, his ears filled with the perpetual rumble of bronze on bronze, as the mirror tracks the slow rotation of the stars. The Latin names were Pharos Alexandrinus or Turris Faria, and sailors in every port of the Mediterranean spoke these syllables with the reverence reserved for words that mean survival. The wind shifts, and suddenly you are breathing the smell of burning pine and resin carried on the night wind, a scent so vivid it seems almost solid, almost something you could reach out and gather in your hands. This is the fuel that feeds the beacon, the substance of its constancy, and it speaks of forests far inland, of axes and mules, and the long supply lines that make such a fire possible night after night, year after year. The keeper tends the fire with wood and perhaps resin, feeding it through the long hours of darkness while the city sleeps and the ships pass, each one a temporary constellation of lights against the greater darkness. You think of the other vessels, even now making their approach, ships from Rhodes, Athens, Syracuse, and Carthage, all steering by this light that has become as fixed and reliable as any celestial body, as any god's eye upon the waters. The fire grows in your perception until it dominates the night, a blazing beacon that seems to fill the upper world with its presence, its warmth almost palpable across the cooling water. The Pharos stood at the entrance to the harbour of Alexandria, positioned with the precision of military engineering to mark the passage between safety and the open sea, between the known and the vast unknown that stretches beyond the pillars of Hercules. Its fire was visible far out to sea, guiding ships safely to port, and you understand now what this means in the body, in the nerves, in the loosening of shoulders that have held tension through storm and calm alike. The original list of world wonders contained the walls of Babylon, those fabled fortifications that had seemed eternal until time proved otherwise, until decay advanced in Hellenistic times beyond any power of imagination to restore them, until the lighthouse took their place in the catalogue of human achievement. Your ship passes into the lee of the island, and the fire is suddenly above you, immense, its radiance so intense that you must look away, down to the water where the reflection shatters and reassembles with every small motion of the waves. The pale limestone of the tower catches the first grey light of morning, though dawn is still hours away, the stone seeming to hold within itself some memory of day that it releases now in faint luminescence against the surrounding dark. You can see the architecture more clearly here, the way each stage of the Pharos steps inward, creating ledges and galleries where figures move with purpose, where the business of keeping the fire consumes human attention as the fire consumes its fuel. The tower reveals itself now as a city in miniature, a vertical settlement dedicated to a single function, elevated to the level of sacred obligation. A sound cuts through the night, human, and yet strange in its distance from the ordinary world of voices, the cry of the watchman calling the hour from the topmost gallery. The words are indistinct at this range, carried oddly by the acoustics of stone and water, but their purpose is clear, a marking of time that parallels the marking of space that the fire itself accomplishes. You imagine the watchman in his high gallery, his eyes moving across the circle of the sea, noting each vessel by its relation to the light, cataloguing the traffic of the world as it flows toward Alexandria, toward the harbour, toward the wealth and learning and power that have made this city the center of all maps. The cry comes again, and something in its cadence suggests not merely the hour, but the continuance of vigilance, the persistence of care across the long duration of darkness. The mirror continues its grinding turn, and you watch the beams sweep across the water, finding your vessel, passing on, returning again in its patient cycle. The bronze surface, polished to the reflectivity of still water, of the moon itself, transforms the chaotic radiance of flame into something directed, something made useful and tame without diminishing its essential wildness. The island of Pharos, small and unremarkable in itself, has become inseparable from the structure that bears its name, the way a soul becomes inseparable from the body it animates, each meaningless without the other. Your vessel turns toward the harbour mouth, and the fire begins to shift in your perspective, no longer ahead, but now to starboard, now astern, as the channel guides you past the tower's immediate presence and into the broader waters within. The orange glow of the great fire dancing on the undersides of clouds follows you, or seems to, though you know it is you who move while the Pharos remains fixed upon its island, fixed upon its purpose, fixed in history as the first lighthouse ever built by the ingenuity of humankind. You think of how many eyes have seen this same sight, how many generations of sailors have found their way home by this same beacon, how the approximately 115 to 160 meters of its height have seemed to grow in meaning even as physical structures of greater elevation have since been constructed. The youngest of the 7 wonders of the ancient world, the replacement for the walls of Babylon, when those walls had decayed in Hellenistic times beyond any hope of continued wonder. The Pharos holds its place not by competition with modern engineering, but by priority, by being first, by having shown what was possible when the need for safe harbour met the capacity for building. The harbour opens before you now, a space of protected water where the lamps of other vessels cluster and multiply, where the sounds of a city awake in darkness reach you across the stillness. Voices, the movement of carts, the splash of oars, the eternal commerce of a port that never fully sleeps. The grinding sound of the bronze mirror mechanism turning on its axis fades behind you, replaced by nearer sounds, more immediate concerns, the particular business of making fast and unloading and finding lodging before the demands of market or embassy or simple rest assert themselves. But the fire remains visible, its light reflected in the harbour water now, doubled and redoubled in the ripples that your own passage creates, as if the Pharos were determined to accompany you even into the city it serves. You breathe deeply, and the smell of burning pine and resin carried on the night wind mingles now with harbour smells, with the stables and kitchens and workshops that line the quays, with the particular density of human habitation that replaces the emptiness of the sea. His fire has guided ships from Rhodes, Athens, Syracuse and Carthage, and will guide others after you, and others after them. The continuity of his service measured not in individual rescues, but in the aggregate fact of safe passage, of harbour reached, of cargoes delivered, and lives continued. The sky above the harbour shows now a faint lessening of darkness in the east, a subtle shift that the eye catches only by comparison with memory, with the true black that has held the hours since sunset. Dawn approaches with the deliberation of all natural processes, neither hurried nor delayed by human need or desire. The pale limestone of the tower, catching the first grey light of morning, will soon reveal itself fully, will stand transformed from a structure of darkness and fire into one of daylight and shadow, its architecture visible to the ordinary eye, its wonder becoming almost commonplace in the clarity of day. This transformation happens every morning, has happened for years, will happen until the day when earthquake or time, or the slow decay that claimed the walls of Babylon, finally claims this youngest of the 7 wonders of the ancient world in its turn. But that day is not this day. This day begins with your safe arrival, with the fire of the Pharos still burning above you, even as its necessity diminishes with the coming light. The cry of the watchman calling the hour from the topmost gallery comes once more, and you notice how the quality of the sound has changed, how the voice seems more ordinary, more human, less the voice of night and vigil, and more simply a man marking time in his employment. The approximately 115 to 160 meters of the tower's height are now visible as verticality, as ascent, as the architectural achievement they represent, rather than as the source of a light that transcended measurement. The island of Pharos, named in Greek and Latin, called letter 1F41, Phi Alpha Rho Omicron Sigma, letter 1F00 Lambda Epsilon Psi Alpha Nu Delta Rho Epsilon Upsilon Sigma, or letter 1F00 Lambda Epsilon Psi Alpha Nu Delta Rho Iota Nu Omicron Sigma, by those who built it, known as Pharos Alexandrinus or Turris Faria in the language of empire, becomes once again a place among places, its extraordinary function temporarily eclipsed by the ordinary miracle of sunrise. The fire is banked now, or you imagine it being banked, the keeper's hands moving with the practiced economy of long habit, reducing the flame to embers that will wait through the day for the return of darkness. Smoke rises in a thin column, visible against the brightening sky, the last signature of the night's burning. The smoke trails across the pale sky in a gesture of completion, of closure, of the day's work ended and the night's work acknowledged. The first lighthouse ever built by human hands rests from its labor, its mirror stilled, its flame subdued, its voice reduced to this single vertical thread of grey against the color that spreads now from horizon to zenith. You stand upon the quay that men have built to hold back the sea, to shape it, to make from it a harbour and a home, and you watch the Pharos complete its transition from wonder to background, from salvation to scenery. Ships from Rhodes, Athens, Syracuse and Carthage continue to move through the harbour, their business undiminished by the change in light, their captains perhaps glancing toward the tower with a gratitude that needs no longer be urgent. The Latin names, Pharos Alexandrinus or Turris Faria, and the Greek, letter 1F41, Phi Alpha Rho Omicron Sigma, letter 1F00 Lambda Epsilon Psi Alpha Nu Delta Rho Epsilon Upsilon Sigma, or letter 1F00 Lambda Epsilon Psi Alpha Nu Delta Rho Iota Nu Omicron Sigma, belong now to the scholars who catalogue and remember, to the sleepers who will need them again when darkness returns. The water breathes against the stone, the same motion that carried you here, that carries all things in time. The stars have faded beyond recovery, their wheeling completed for this rotation. The fire of the Pharos, first and tallest of lighthouses, approximately 115 to 160 meters of human ambition made stone and flame and polished bronze, stands waiting upon its island for the night that will come again, as nights always come, as the need for guidance persists across all the harbours of history. You are standing beneath a covered walkway in the palace quarter of Alexandria, where the morning light falls in long rectangles across the marble floor. The heat of the Egyptian street still clings to your shoulders, but here in the colonnade the air has begun to cool, and the distant sound of fountains in the palace gardens reaches you as a gentle murmur through the rows of columns. The Library of Alexandria, the most important library of antiquity, lies somewhere ahead through these shaded corridors, founded in the early 3rd century BCE as part of the extensive cultural policy of King Ptolemy I. You move forward slowly, and the cool of the shaded porticos, after the heat of the street, settles into your skin like a hand laid softly upon your brow. The scholar ahead of you walks with measured steps, his sandals making no sound on the worn stone. He carries a small wooden tablet and a stylus, and his head moves slightly as if he is rehearsing something he intends to say. Around you, the merchants are unloading their cargoes of papyrus from boats that have come up the canal from the harbour, and the smell of cedar oil used to preserve the scrolls from the damp drifts from somewhere deeper in the complex. The library rooms were in the palace district of the city, and you follow the scholar through an archway where the light changes, becoming softer, filtered through linen curtains that move slightly in the passage of air. The dry rustle of papyrus being unrolled across a wooden table comes to you from an open doorway, and you pause there, watching the movement of hands across the pale surface. The hall stretches before you, lined with high shelves of pigeonholes where scrolls lie in ordered ranks, each tagged with small wooden labels in scholarly hands. The scratching of reed pens on fresh sheets rises and falls like breathing from the far end of the room, where copyists sit in good light, transcribing texts onto fresh papyrus. You observe how the morning has climbed higher, how the windows now catch the sun at a steeper angle, throwing ladders of brightness across the floor where dust moves slowly in the stillness. The library possessed an enormous, but today unknown number of scrolls, and you sense this abundance in the sheer vertical presence of the shelves, in the repeated small rectangles of stored knowledge reaching toward the shadowed ceiling. The collection included both literary writings and large quantities of scientific literature from various fields, and the labels you can read from where you stand speak of geometry, of medicine, of the movements of stars. A door opens to your left, and younger men enter carrying baskets, their arms full of new cylinders wrapped in protective cloth. A new shipment of books arrives from Athens, payment for a debt or a gift between kings, and you watch as they are received with quiet ceremony, as names are recorded and the outer wrappings set aside for reuse. The library stood in close connection to the Museum of Alexandria, and you feel this connection in the way the space is arranged, not merely for storage, but for the living work of minds upon minds. Both institutions were financed by the Ptolemaic rulers, and the marble under your feet, the quality of the light, the very presence of so many gathered texts speak of deliberate and sustained patronage. The library probably functioned primarily as a school and research library of the museum, and you notice how the copyists do not work alone, but in pairs, how a man with a long beard leans over to correct the hand of a younger one, how the transfer of knowledge passes through fingers and voices as much as through ink. The scholar you followed has moved to a central table where a large wooden cabinet stands open, its drawers holding slender rods of ivory and bone. The chief librarian checks the catalogue, a pinax, searching for a missing work of Sophocles, and his finger moves down a column of names while his lips shape words without sound. You drift closer, drawn by the concentration in his posture, by the way the morning has advanced so far that the light now falls upon his shoulder and illuminates the pale wood of the catalogue board. The scratching of reed pens on fresh sheets continues around you, and the smell of cedar oil used to preserve the scrolls from the damp seems to strengthen as the day warms, rising from the opened boxes and the recently handled scrolls. The distant sound of fountains in the palace gardens persists, a continuous low music that underlies all other sounds in this place. You turn from the catalogue and find yourself before a shelf where the labels are older, the wood darkened by the oil of many hands. The exact time of its end is unclear, with estimates ranging from 48 BCE to the 7th century CE, and this uncertainty seems present in the room, a future shadow that cannot quite reach backward to dim the present light. No remains of the library have been found to date, yet here you stand among its substantial presence, the weight of gathered thought all around you. Texts from ancient authors provide some information about the library, and you imagine those authors in this same light, moving through these same spaces, their own fingers finding the same wooden labels. The cool of the shaded porticos after the heat of the street returns to your memory as the day advances, and the interior warmth begins to rise, though slowly, held at bay by the thickness of the walls. A smaller daughter library was located in the Serapeion of Alexandria, and you wonder at the reach of this institution, at the network of rooms and buildings that must extend through the city. The Serapeion was in the southwest of the city, in a district inhabited by native Egyptians, a different world from this palace quarter with its Greek letters and its organized ambition. The scratching of reed pens on fresh sheets pauses, resumes, pauses again in the rhythm of work that will continue across the hours you will not stay to witness. The library served not only scientific purposes, but also the power demonstration of the Ptolemies, and you understand this now in the scale of the architecture, in the implicit statement that knowledge itself could be gathered, ordered, made subject to royal will. The scholar at the catalogue has found his reference or abandoned the search and moves away through a doorway that leads deeper into the complex. You follow for a time, passing rooms where men sit in circles, speaking, passing others where solitary figures bend close to texts that seem to require all the light they can gather. The library continued to operate under Roman administration from 30 BCE onward, though this fact belongs to a future still distant from the day you inhabit, a future that will transform but not immediately destroy. The spectacular destruction of the library in 48 BCE is considered unlikely, and you feel the relief of this, the way a possible violence has been set aside by the judgment of later study. The legend of its destruction by the Arabs in 642 CE is also unfounded, and another shadow recedes, though the true ending remains wrapped in the same uncertainty that surrounds so much of antiquity. The afternoon has advanced invisibly, measured only by the migration of light across floors and the gradual slowing of the scratching of reed pens on fresh sheets. The copyists begin to straighten their backs, to set their work in order, to cover the fresh sheets with thin cloth against the settling dust. Evening closes the reading rooms. The scrolls are returned to their cedar boxes, and you watch the methodical tenderness of this process, the way each cylinder is checked against its label, the way the cedar lids fit softly into place. The smell of cedar oil used to preserve the scrolls from the damp intensifies as the boxes are closed, as the accumulated preservation of centuries seems to concentrate in this moment of storage. The distant sound of fountains in the palace gardens continues, though changed now, carrying something of the cooling air, of the day turning toward its completion. You find your way back through the colonnades, and the cool of the shaded porticos after the heat of the street has reversed itself, the exterior now releasing its stored warmth while the corridors maintain their steady temperature. They contributed significantly to Alexandria replacing Athens as the center of Greek science in the 3rd century BCE, and this achievement seems complete around you, unquestioned, established in the very atmosphere of the place. The scholar walks ahead of you now, his figure smaller in the diminished light, his path taking him toward some lodging within the palace quarter or beyond. A large collection probably existed soon after the founding and grew over generations, and you sense this growth as a physical pressure in the walls, as the accumulated density of preserved speech. The scratching of reed pens on fresh sheets has ended entirely, and in the silence that follows you hear more clearly the distant sound of fountains in the palace gardens, now accompanied by the first tentative sounds of evening insects. You emerge from the colonnade into the open air of early evening, and the sky above Alexandria shows the first softening of its blue toward darkness. The stars that will appear above this city are the same stars catalogued in its halls, the same stars that moved Greek science to this Egyptian shore. The scratching of reed pens on fresh sheets will resume with the light, the copyists returning to their benches, the scholars to their searches. The distant sound of fountains in the palace gardens will continue through the darkness, a constant presence that marks the hours without measuring them. You turn from the palace quarter and walk toward the harbour, where the lighthouse established in the previous chapter still stands upon its island, its fire banked but not extinguished. The Library of Alexandria remains behind you in its rooms of ordered knowledge, its exact time of end still unclear, with estimates ranging from 48 BCE to the 7th century CE. The harbour moves with evening activity, with the unloading of boats and the preparation of others for departure. Yet the two sounds coexist in your attention, the library and the harbour both present, both aspects of Alexandria's sustained gathering of the world's matter and knowledge. You find a place to stand at the water's edge, and the lighthouse fire makes its first visible assertion against the darkening sky. The scratching of reed pens on fresh sheets will continue under whatever administration comes, the work of transcription indifferent to the names of rulers. The distant sound of fountains in the palace gardens has faded entirely now, lost in the larger acoustic of wind and water and human activity, but you retain it. Hold it as you hold the smell of cedar oil used to preserve the scrolls from the damp, as sensory evidence of a place that exists now only in texts and in the reconstructed experience of attention. The night completes its arrival over Alexandria, and the stars emerge in their ancient patterns. The Library of Alexandria, founded in the early 3rd century BCE as part of the extensive cultural policy of King Ptolemy I, persists in its darkness of closed boxes and silent halls, waiting for the morning that will come again, as mornings always come, as the need for knowledge persists across all the harbours of history. You remain at the harbour's edge as the night deepens, and the lighthouse maintains its steady signal. The scratching of reed pens on fresh sheets waits in the same future, in the same renewal of activity that has characterized this place since the early 3rd century BCE. The distant sound of fountains in the palace gardens may still continue, may be reaching you through some acoustic channel you cannot trace, or may have ceased with the hours of darkness, to resume with the light. The harbour water moves against the stones with a rhythm that requires no interpretation. That simply continues. The Library of Alexandria, with its enormous but today unknown number of scrolls, continues in its own rhythm of preservation and use, of morning opening and evening closing, of generation following generation of scholars and copyists and seekers. You stand at the harbour at dawn, though whether this is the same dawn or another you cannot determine, the narrative of your presence having become fluid, accommodating both continuous and discontinuous time. The Library of Alexandria receives the first light in its high windows, and the copyists are already stirring in their quarters, preparing their reed pens for the day's work. The scratching of reed pens on fresh sheets will begin again, and the chief librarian will again check the catalogue, a pinax, searching perhaps for the same missing work of Sophocles or for another text entirely. You move through the colonnades again, though now perhaps as memory, perhaps as continued presence, the distinction having softened in the long hours of your attention. The Library of Alexandria stands around you in its morning activity, its scrolls in their pigeonhole shelves, its labels in scholarly hands, its copyists preparing their fresh papyrus. The scratching of reed pens on fresh sheets provides the underlying pulse of this educational activity, the transfer of knowledge through manual labor, through the patient replication of character upon character. The chief librarian moves through the halls with a presence that has become familiar to you, his search for texts a continuous theme in the morning's activity. You observe from a distance that has become comfortable, that requires no explanation or negotiation. The morning advances, and the light in the high windows moves across the floor in its predictable path. You find yourself before a shelf you do not remember, its labels written in a hand that seems older, more hurried, perhaps an early cataloguing before the establishment of the present system. This seems appropriate to the place, to the way knowledge can subsume the immediate in pursuit of the extended, the way the scholar at his text can forget the passage of time until the light changes or some external demand intrudes. The chief librarian has completed his search, or abandoned it again, and stands now in conversation with a younger man who gestures with animation toward the harbour. Perhaps the missing Sophocles has arrived, or been found, or been determined irrecoverable. The day has reached its height, and the light in the halls has become more direct, more assertive, though still filtered through the linen curtains that move slightly in the passage of air. The scratching of reed pens on fresh sheets has slowed, the copyists pausing in their labor, perhaps to eat, perhaps simply to rest their hands and eyes in the manner of workers across all times and places. You move toward an opening in the colonnade, and the brightness of the exterior makes you pause, the adjustment of vision requiring its own duration. This exchange of temperatures seems emblematic, seems to speak of the larger exchanges that characterize this place, this city at the meeting of Mediterranean and Egyptian, of Greek and native, of preservation and loss. The Library of Alexandria, with its exact time of end unclear, with estimates ranging from 48 BCE to the 7th century CE, holds this uncertainty at its center, this knowledge that what is gathered may be dispersed, that what is preserved may yet be lost. The harbour is visible from where you stand, and the lighthouse upon its island maintains its presence, its fire invisible in the daylight, but implied, continuous, waiting for the darkness that will require its assertion. You return to the interior, and the dry rustle of papyrus being unrolled across a wooden table greets you from the nearest room, where a single reader has remained at his work through the hour of rest. The scratching of reed pens on fresh sheets resumes from another quarter of the building, as the copyists return to their benches for the afternoon's labor. The distant sound of fountains in the palace gardens reaches you again, renewed in your attention by the temporary absence, and the smell of cedar oil used to preserve the scrolls from the damp enfolds you as you move deeper into the halls. The afternoon progresses in its measured way, and the light begins its long decline toward the windowsills. The chief librarian has resumed his search, or begun another, and you observe him from the doorway of a smaller room where maps are stored, their surfaces cracked and darkened with age. The evening approaches with the same inevitability that governed the previous day, and the same rituals of closure begin to repeat themselves. The scrolls are returned to their cedar boxes with the same methodical tenderness you observed before, the same checking of labels, the same soft fitting of lids. The distant sound of fountains in the palace gardens continues through the gathering darkness, and the scratching of reed pens on fresh sheets subsides into the softer sounds of closure, of departure, of the library settling into its night silence. You find yourself at the threshold between interior and exterior, and the cool of the shaded porticos, after the heat of the street, has become the cool of evening after the heat of day. The same larger rhythm you observed before, now repeated, and therefore confirmed as pattern. The harbour moves with evening activity, and the lighthouse fire makes its visible assertion against the darkening sky. The night completes its arrival over Alexandria, and the stars emerge in their ancient patterns. You remain at the harbour's edge as the night deepens, and the lighthouse maintains its steady signal. The harbour water moves against the stones with a rhythm that requires no interpretation, that simply continues. Table. The grain of the wood beneath your fingers carries the faint warmth of yesterday's lamp, and somewhere beyond the open window, the morning harbour sends its first sounds across the water. You are standing in the mathematician's workroom at the Museum of Alexandria, and the grit of sand underfoot shifts softly as you move toward the central table where a man already kneels in concentration. The Museum of Alexandria was a significant scientific institution, and its rooms awaken slowly, each one finding its purpose as the sun climbs above the Egyptian coast. Around you, the mathematician draws his diagrams in the sand spread across the stone surface, the stylus making small whispering scratches that seem to hold entire geometries within their brief existence. His hand moves with the patience of a man who has spent years in this particular room, in this particular institution that the Ptolemaic rulers financed with the wealth of their kingdom. The sand receives his lines, holds them for a moment, and surrenders them again to the smoothing palm when the proof requires revision. The morning light enters through the high window in a single pale block, and you can see the dust turning slowly within it, each particle finding its own unhurried orbit. The Alexandrian school developed at the Museum, and that development continues now in the quiet concentration of this man and his sand table, in the way his stylus pauses, lifts, returns to make a correction. His lips move slightly, forming words in Greek that correspond to the proportions he is testing, and the sound is so soft it barely disturbs the air between you. The Ptolemies provided salaries and common meals for the scholars, and this security shows in the unhurried quality of his work, in the absence of any need to rush toward a conclusion before the day demands something else. You notice how the sand underfoot has been swept into gentle ridges by earlier passages, how it holds the memory of footsteps that crossed this room in the hours before dawn. A door opens somewhere in the adjoining chamber, and the scent of olive oil from the common lamps drifts through the connecting passage, carried by the slight movement of air between spaces. The mathematician does not look up, though his hand stills for a moment, suspended above his diagram with the stylus held like a wand of possible truths. You are standing at the harbour at dawn. The voice of the institution seems to say, though you have not moved from this room, and the metaphor holds because the Museum of Alexandria gathered scholars from across the Greek world who were invited to work there, drawing them like vessels into this port of the mind. The stylus descends again, and the proof continues its slow emergence from the sand, from the mind, from the particular silence of this morning that will never be repeated in exactly this configuration of light and dust and concentration. The physician's clinic occupies the chamber adjacent to the mathematician's workroom, separated by a wall of pale limestone that carries sound in unexpected ways. You move through the connecting doorway, and the quality of attention changes, becomes directed toward the particular suffering of a body seated on a low wooden bench. The physician examines a patient in the adjoining clinic, recording symptoms for the case notes, and his instruments of bronze and obsidian lie arranged on a cloth beside him. The metallic taste of bronze astronomical instruments warmed by the sun is not present here, though you will encounter it later when the day carries you upward. Instead, the clinic holds the sharper scents of vinegar and the herbs used to clean wounds and prepare poultices. The physician speaks to his patient in Greek that carries the softer vowels of the Egyptian coast, and the patient responds with the tension of one who has learned to translate pain into observable phenomena. The physician's fingers pressed gently along the patient's forearm, following the channels that the Alexandrian school developed at the museum, the accumulated knowledge of bodily systems that travelled here from Athens and was transformed by the particular methods of this place. The museum was financed by the Ptolemaic rulers, and that financing extended to the practical arts of healing, to the collection of case notes that would accumulate across years into a body of understanding. You observe how the physician's hand pauses at a particular point, how his eyes meet his patient's with the brief acknowledgement of something found, something named. The patient relaxes slightly, as if the naming itself were a form of treatment, and the physician reaches for his stylus to make marks on a fresh sheet of papyrus. The dry rustle joins the morning's quiet sounds, and the scent of olive oil from the common lamps seems to reach even here, binding the separate chambers into a single institution. The physician completes his examination, and the patient rises with the slow care of one whose body has become a territory of uncertainty. You follow neither of them as they part at the clinic door. Instead, you turn toward the stair that leads upward, toward the rooftop where the astronomer already moves among his instruments. The stair is narrow, built for function rather than procession, and the stone has been worn into gentle hollows by the feet of scholars who have climbed here across the decades of the museum's existence. The institution included scholars in mathematics, medicine, astronomy, and literature, and you are passing now through the vertical geography of their separate but connected purposes, each floor holding its own quality of attention, its own particular silence. The morning has advanced sufficiently that the sun strikes the upper walls, and the stairwell holds a warmth that was absent in the lower rooms. You emerge onto the rooftop observatory, and the harbour spreads before you in its vast particularity, the water holding the morning light in a way that seems to concentrate and distribute it simultaneously. The astronomer checks the alignment of instruments in the rooftop observatory, his hands moving with the delicacy of one who knows that precision is itself a form of reverence. Around you, the merchants are unloading their cargoes at the distant wharves, their movements small with distance, their voices lost entirely in the space between the museum and the water's edge. The astronomer has not noticed your presence, or if he has incorporated it into the field of his observation as he would any other phenomenon that does not require immediate classification. His bronze instruments carry the metallic taste of bronze astronomical instruments warmed by the sun, though you do not taste them directly. The sensation arrives through the synesthetic generosity of this place, where knowledge moves between the senses with an ease that the scholars themselves might not acknowledge. The astronomer mutters figures in Greek, adjusting the angle of a sighting tube, and the murmur of Greek in various dialects echoing in the colonnade will later join this rooftop murmur into a larger texture of voices. For now, his is solitary, directed toward the verification of a stellar position that his predecessors recorded, that his successors will refine. The museum was dedicated to the muses, and you feel that dedication in the way his attention refuses distraction, in the way the harbour's commerce continues below without impinging upon the higher purpose of this roof. The Ptolemies reportedly provided salaries and common meals for scholars at the Library of Alexandria, and the astronomer's robe suggests the slight wear of one who may not have needed to maintain appearances for patrons who judged by surfaces. His instruments, by contrast, are polished to a particular sheen, maintained with an attention that approaches devotion. A cloud passes across the sun, and the bronze instruments dim for a moment before reclaiming their warmth. The astronomer makes a final notation, and you sense the completion of this phase of his morning's work, the way he steps back from the instrument with the satisfaction of one who has verified what he expected to find. The Alexandrian school developed at the museum, and its emphasis on accumulating verified observations helped establish traditions that would eventually require new frameworks of understanding. The astronomer gathers his instruments with practiced movements, and you descend the stair ahead of him, returning to the lower levels where the morning has advanced into the fuller activities of the institution's daily round. The covered walk extends before you as you reach the ground floor, a colonnade of limestone columns that filters the sunlight into rhythmic patterns across the stone floor. The murmur of Greek in various dialects echoing in the colonnade reaches you now as a living texture, the voices of scholars who have emerged from their separate chambers to share the common spaces of the museum. A poet recites new verses in the covered walk, testing them against the classical models, and his voice carries the slight hesitation of composition, the pause between phrases where possibility has not yet resolved into certainty. Around you, other scholars move through the colonnade with the unhurried pace of those who know their destination will wait, their own conversations weaving beneath and around the poet's recitation in a polyphony that the space seems designed to accommodate. The poet stands in a patch of sunlight that falls between two columns, and his hand moves in small gestures that accompany but do not illustrate his verses. You find a place against the wall where the stone holds the morning's accumulated coolness, and the grit of sand underfoot in the mathematician's workroom seems to cling still to your sandals, a trace of the morning's first chamber carried into this second movement of the day. The poet's verses speak of a harbour, of vessels departing and returning, and the metaphor feels inevitable in this place where the actual harbour lies within hearing distance, where the scholars themselves have arrived from across the Greek world and will eventually depart again. The poet completes his trial recitation, and the small group that has gathered around him responds with the measured praise of peers who understand the labour that precedes apparent ease. The covered walk, the dining hall, and the lecture rooms of the museum form a connected geography of which you are moving through, and the dining hall draws the morning toward its centre, the common meal that the Ptolemies provided as part of their support for this community of minds. You follow the general movement of scholars through a doorway where the scent of olive oil from the common lamps intensifies, mingling now with the aromas of bread and the prepared dishes that attend the midday gathering. The dining hall receives you with its particular quality of light, the high windows arranged to illuminate the long tables without the harshness of direct exposure. Scholars gather for the common meal, discussing in Greek the nature of the cosmos, and their voices rise and fall in patterns that the hall itself seems to shape, to moderate into a collective murmur from which individual assertions occasionally emerge like the figures in a woven textile. You find a place at the edge of the gathering, where the stone bench meets your weight with the slight give of long use, and a scholar to your left continues an argument about the proportions of the celestial spheres that he began in the covered walk and shows no sign of concluding. The Ptolemaic rulers financed this gathering as they financed the institution itself, and the bread before you carries the slight sweetness of Egyptian grain, distinct from the harder loaves of the Greek mainland that some of these scholars remember from their arrival years ago. The physician from the morning's clinic sits across the hall, his case notes apparently concluded, his attention now given to a discussion of bodily humours that connects his morning's particular observations to the broader theories of the Alexandrian school. The museum was traditionally associated with the Muses, and some scholars suggest this dedication may have encompassed a practical philosophy, a willingness to move between the observation of a single patient's pulse and the classification of all vital processes. The common meal continues, and the arguments develop with the slow richness of fermentation, of ideas left to mature in the shared vessel of this hall. A server moves through the tables with a vessel of watered wine, and the scholar to your left accepts a refill with a nod that does not interrupt his discourse. The poet sits at a farther table, apparently silent, his morning's verses perhaps still turning in the private space where composition continues even in apparent rest. The meal concludes with the slow dispersal of scholars back toward their separate purposes, the dining hall emptying in a gradual wave that leaves the tables to the servers and the fading echoes of argument. You move with the general direction of the crowd, though your own purpose remains the open receptivity of witness, the position that allows you to pass through these chambers without the urgency of a particular task. The covered walk receives you again, and the afternoon light falls now from a different angle, the columns casting longer shadows across the stone where the poet had stood in his patch of morning sun. The Museum of Alexandria gathered scholars from across the Greek world who were invited to work there, and the afternoon reveals this gathering in its fuller complexity, the way different temperaments and traditions have settled into a collective rhythm that is not uniformity, but something more interesting, a sustained chord of distinct notes. You find yourself in a lecture room where a physician from a different tradition than the morning's practitioner speaks to a small audience about the treatment of fevers, his method deriving from the observations recorded in the case notes that accumulate in this institution's archives. The lecture room holds a different quality of attention than the dining hall or the covered walk, a directed focus that the speaker's presence organizes into a temporary unity. The Alexandrian school developed at the Museum, and its development continues in exchanges such as this, in the questioning that follows the formal presentation, in the way a scholar from Kos challenges a particular dosage, while another from Sicily offers a confirming observation from his own practice. The lecture disperses, and you move again through the connecting passages, the scent of olive oil from the common lamps now carrying the slight additional note of afternoon burning, the lamps having been replenished for the hours of reading and discussion that precede the evening. You pass the mathematician's workroom and find it empty, the sand table smoothed and waiting for the morning's return, the proof of the morning apparently concluded or perhaps abandoned in favor of a different approach. The grit of sand underfoot in the mathematician's workroom is absent here in the passage, though you seem to carry its memory in the slight resistance of your sandal soles against the cleaner stone. The afternoon advances toward its later phases, and the light that enters the high windows takes on the longer angles, the warmer tones, of a day moving toward completion. You find your way to the rooftop again, though the astronomer has departed, his instruments covered now against the evening dew, the bronze surfaces protected by oiled cloths that will preserve their precision for tomorrow's observations. The harbour spreads before you in its afternoon activity, the vessels that unloaded cargoes in the morning now preparing for departure or receiving new loads for the return voyages. The evening cool rising from the harbour as the scholars walk home has not yet arrived, though you can sense its preparation in the way the air begins to shift, in the first hints of the temperature differential that will draw the cooler maritime air across the city as the land releases its accumulated warmth. You descend again, and the Museum of Alexandria surrounds you with its accumulated hours, the way a day in this place contains multiple days' worth of attention and exchange. The covered walk holds now a different population, scholars who have emerged for the evening air before the common meal that follows the day's work, though this gathering is more diffuse, more oriented toward the transition between the institution's formal round and the private hours that follow. The poet stands again in his accustomed place, though he does not recite now, his hand resting on a column as he listens to a scholar from the astronomical quarters speak of a new theory of planetary motion. The conversation between these two disciplines, these two modes of attention to pattern and recurrence, proceeds with the mutual respect of those who recognize a common dedication to the muses, to the forms that persist and reward return. The Museum was dedicated to the muses, And that dedication encompasses this evening exchange as fully as the morning's more formal activities, perhaps more fully, for the loosening of institutional structure allows unexpected connections to form, allows the poet's ear for rhythm to inform the astronomer's sense of celestial periodicity, or vice versa, the traffic moving in both directions across the apparent boundary between their arts. The evening advances, and the scholars begin the gradual dispersal that will eventually leave the museum's common spaces to the servers and the night watch, to the silence that prepares for the next day's renewal. The day ends with the scholars returning to their modest quarters, their minds still turning on problems, and you move with the general flow toward the outer passages, toward the doors that lead to the streets of Alexandria. Around you, a mathematician continues a discussion begun at the common meal, his hands moving in the gestures of geometry even as he walks, and a physician listens with the particular patience of one who understands that all discourse bears eventually upon the health of the body politic, if not immediately upon individual bodies. The streets of Alexandria receive the scholars from the museum, absorb them into the larger life of the city that has supported and been supported by this institution across the decades of its flourishing. The Ptolemaic rulers financed this dispersal as they financed the gathering, understanding that the scholars' presence in the city's taverns and private houses extended the museum's influence beyond its physical walls. The scent of olive oil from the common lamps lingers in your own perception, though the actual lamps have been extinguished or reduced to the minimum that night requires, and the grit of sand underfoot in the mathematician's workroom seems to have transferred itself to these streets, or perhaps the streets themselves carry their own particular abrasions, the dust of an ancient city that has witnessed countless such evenings of scholars returning home with their minds still occupied. The scholars separate at intersections, each moving toward the particular quarter where their residence lies, and the metallic taste of bronze astronomical instruments warmed by the sun returns to your perception as a memory, as a synesthetic trace of the astronomer's rooftop that persists even in the evening's cooler air. You find yourself at a corner where the harbour becomes visible again, the water now holding the evening light in a way that seems to concentrate the day's final warmth. The harbour receives the last of the day's light, and the vessels that moved cargoes in the morning now rest at their moorings, their crews gathered in their own common meals, their own evening dispersals. You reach the door of your own quarters, and the scent of olive oil from the common lamps seems to make one final appearance, as if the museum itself extends this far, as if the dedication to the muses permeates even the private spaces that lie beyond its formal boundaries. The day completes itself in the quiet of your own chamber, in the way the evening cool rising from the harbour as the scholars walk home has become the particular temperature of this room, this moment of transition between the institution's formal round and the private renewal that sleep will bring. The night advances, and the harbour's sounds diminish, and the scholars of the museum rest in their modest quarters, their minds still turning on problems that will resume with the morning's first light, with the stylus's first scratch in the waiting sand, with the instrument's first alignment against the patient stars. The first light of morning spreads across the eastern harbour of Alexandria, and you are standing upon the quay where the fishing boats have already begun their return. The water carries the smell of salt and river silt together, that particular mingling of sea and Nile which defines this city above all other places. Around you, the Egyptian quarter stirs to life with rhythms far older than the Greek houses rising to the west. A woman carries her jar to the communal well, her feet finding paths worn smooth by generations of similar mornings. The mud brick walls absorb the dawn's warmth slowly, holding the night's coolness against your palm as you pass. Somewhere beyond the narrow lanes, a donkey protests its load with a sound that echoes against the close-backed buildings. The Ptolemaic kingdom was characterized by a mixture of ancient Egyptian traditions and Greek Macedonian ruling culture. And nowhere does this mixture press upon the senses more immediately than in these first hours when two worlds share a single dawn. The sky lightens to the color of pale amber above the Pharos, and the daily procession of laborers begins its movement toward the docks. You notice how their garments mark their origins without words needing to be spoken. The native Egyptian population lived largely in the older quarters and the countryside, and here in the narrow streets their linen wraps fall in folds unchanged since the days of the Ramessides. Their speech carries the cadences of a language that priests have written in hieroglyphs for 30 centuries, a tongue that murmurs in market bargains and domestic quarrels with undiminished vigor. A dog sleeps curled against a doorway where the plaster has crumbled to reveal older brick beneath. The heat rising from different pavements makes itself known even now, the mud brick of the Egyptian quarter warming differently under your feet than the limestone you will later encounter. The clatter of wooden clappers in an Egyptian religious procession reaches you from some temple interior, that sharp rhythmic percussion which accompanies the god from his resting place into the morning air. A Greek merchant passes through, his clothing and speech marking him as foreign, and the texture of the street changes momentarily around his passage. His chiton falls in the manner of the Aegean, its wool lighter in weave than the local linen, and his sandals announce themselves with a different cadence upon the beaten earth. He pauses to enquire after some commodity, his Greek rising above the surrounding murmur with the clarity of a language that commands official recognition even here. Greek settlers dominated the new city of Alexandria, yet this merchant's expression reveals his uncertainty in these older passages where the Greek grid of streets gives way to organic growth. A child darts past, carrying bread, her gaze lingering on the stranger's dress with that particular curiosity which recognizes difference without yet understanding its meaning. The lighter smell of olive oil and wine from the Greek houses clings to the merchant's person, carried from his own lodging perhaps, or from the warehouse where his samples await inspection. You watch him consult a scrap of papyrus, his lips moving through figures that represent calculations in a script the local scribes have learned to accommodate, but never fully embraced as their own. The morning advances, and you find yourself moving toward the great temple whose pylons rise above the surrounding structures with the authority of accumulated centuries. The heavy scent of Kai-Fi incense in the Egyptian temple greets you from 20 cubits distant, that complex perfume of honey, wine, raisins, and aromatic woods which the priests compound according to recipes preserved on temple walls. Within the courtyard, the double face of Ptolemaic rule reveals itself with quiet precision. A priest speaks Greek to one petitioner, Egyptian to another, his voice shifting between the two with the ease of long practice. The Ptolemies presented themselves to the Egyptians as pharaohs, and this priest embodies that presentation in his very person, his shaved head and leopard skin garment speaking the visual language of pharaonic service, while his tongue serves the administrative needs of a Greek-speaking state. You observe how the petitioners themselves divide by language, the Greek speaker presenting his case with the rhetorical flourishes of the agora, the Egyptian offering his request with the directness of one who addresses a power he has known since childhood. The temple's interior receives the morning light through clerestory windows, and the dust motes move in slow procession through the illuminated air. The Ptolemies assume the role of pharaonic god-kings, and here in the sanctuary that assumption achieves its most concentrated expression. The god's statue rests in his shrine, his composite face gazing upon a world that has learned to see divinity in features both Greek and Egyptian. Greek and Egyptian language, religion, and culture existed side by side in the kingdom, and the very stone of this building has absorbed both streams of devotion across the decades of Ptolemaic foundation. A scribe sits in the corner, his palette bearing the marks of both Demotic and Greek notations, his brush moving between scripts with the same facility the priest displayed in speech. The sound of Orlo's pipes from a Greek symposium reaches you faintly from some distant quarter, that reedy double pipe which accompanies drinking and philosophical conversation in the Macedonian manner, its tones floating across the intervening streets to mingle improbably with the temple's incumbent silence. The day moves toward its height, and you follow the gathering crowd toward the precinct of Serapis, where a mixed assembly has gathered for the festival. The Serapean cult combined Greek and Egyptian elements, and this festival manifests that combination in every visible particular. The procession forms with Greek musicians in their festival dress, alongside Egyptian carriers of the gods' emblems, their movements coordinated through long tradition rather than any single cultural imperative. The god Serapis was a deliberate creation blending Osiris and Zeus, and his devotees reflect that deliberate blending in their own persons. You notice a merchant whose father came from Cyrene speaking with a priest whose family has served Egyptian gods since the Sate dynasty, their conversation moving between languages as the subject requires. Children play in the streets, some speaking both languages, others only one, their games requiring no shared tongue beyond the universal dialect of play itself. A girl chases her companion with a painted doll, her Greek commands answered by Egyptian laughter, the pursuit continuing regardless of this linguistic asymmetry. The festival reaches its central moment as the cult statue is displayed upon its portable shrine, and the crowd's murmur rises to that particular pitch which indicates collective absorption. They partially mixed, these two populations, and in this crowd the partial nature of that mixing becomes visible in the precise gradations of dress, gesture, and speech. Some faces turn toward the god with the ecstatic expression of Greek mystery devotion, others with the composed reverence of Egyptian temple practice, and many with some intermediate effect that belongs properly to neither tradition, yet serves this deliberate synthesis. The heat rising from different pavements presses upon you now with midday intensity, the limestone of the Greek quarter and the mud brick of the Egyptian each releasing its stored warmth, and the crowd's proximity adds its own warmth to that of the sun. A vendor moves through with cooled wine, his Greek accent marking him as one who has found his livelihood in serving these moments of collective gathering. The afternoon finds you in the streets between quarters, where the transition from one world to another occurs with geographical precision. Here a wall marks the boundary, its plaster bearing Greek graffiti on one face, Egyptian demotic on the other, as if the very stones participated in the kingdom's bilingual character. The Ptolemies presented themselves to the Greeks as Greek rulers, and that presentation required the maintenance of spaces where Greek culture could flourish without the compromising influence of Egyptian antiquity. Yet compromise, or rather creative fusion, has occurred nonetheless. A workshop produces faience amulets in shapes that borrow from both iconographic traditions, its proprietor conversing with customers in whichever language they prefer. The light begins its long decline toward the western harbour, and the streets reveal their changing populations with the transparency of evening movement. Families gather their children from the communal spaces where the afternoon's mixing occurred, and the direction of their footsteps indicates the pattern of residence that underlies the day's apparent integration. You observe a Greek family entering their courtyard, the gate closing behind them with a sound that marks the boundary between public encounter and domestic retreat. The evening finds the two communities retreating to their separate quarters, the city temporarily divided, and you follow the movement toward the Greek district, where the streets broaden and the houses display their prosperity with less reticence. A symposium is preparing in the house you pass, the orlos player tuning his instrument while servants arrange the couches according to established custom. Ptolemaic Egypt was considered the richest and most powerful of the successor states to Alexander's empire. And this richness manifests in the very texture of these evening gatherings, the imported silver, the aged wine, the educated conversation that will extend through the night. Greek settlers dominated the new city of Alexandria, and their domination asserts itself most completely in these hours when the Egyptian quarter seems distant, almost foreign, though separated by mere streets. The darkness gathers, and you find yourself upon a vantage where both quarters remain visible, the one marked by temple towers and close-backed roofs, the other by the broader spacing of planned construction. It was a leading example of Greek civilization, this city, yet that leadership depended upon the Egyptian foundation it both transcended and incorporated. The harbour glitters with lamps from the ships at anchor, and the Pharos beacon begins its nightly rotation, that great fire which guides vessels toward a port that serves both Greek commerce and Egyptian grain. Internally, the kingdom was characterized by a double face of Ptolemaic rule, and in this evening view that doubleness achieves a kind of aesthetic resolution, two cities coexisting in the space of one, their separation as necessary to their identity as their daily intermingling. The heat rising from different pavements releases slowly into the cooling air, the limestone and mud brick, each breathing at its own thermal pace, and you feel the evening breeze begin to move across the harbour. A final procession moves through the Egyptian streets, the god returning to his sanctuary after the day's festival, and the clatter of wooden clappers marks the hour with ritual precision. The sound of Orlo's pipes from a Greek symposium answers from the opposite direction, neither sound dominating, each finding its proper auditors. You remain at your vantage as the stars emerge above the harbour, their light falling impartially upon both quarters, upon the temple pylons and the gymnasium porticos, upon the mud brick and the limestone alike. For now, the city rests in its division, two worlds held in temporary suspension, awaiting the dawn that will call them once more into their daily negotiation of coexistence, their perpetual invention of a city that contains within itself the breadth of the known world civilizations. The harbour at Alexandria lies still beneath a sky the colour of wet slate, and you are standing at the edge of the great harbour where the water has not yet begun to reflect the coming sun. Around you, the wooden cranes stand like sleeping herons above the quays, their ropes slack in the pre-dawn calm. The air carries the cold breath of the Mediterranean, and you taste salt already on your lips from the harbour spray that has settled during the night. Somewhere to your west, beyond the sleeping city, the Hepte Stadium stretches its 7 stadia across the water, that great causeway connecting the mainland to Pharos Island, its warehouses dark and silent until the first porters arrive. Before dawn, the porters begin their work. You watch them emerge from the shadows between the warehouses, their sandals scuffing against the stone as they move sacks of grain from river boats to seagoing vessels. Alexandria possessed the largest seaport in Egypt, and this truth reveals itself in the sheer scale of movement that unfolds even in this half-light. The men grunt softly as they lift each sack, their bodies bent against the weight of Egyptian grain that will travel onward to feed Rome's growing population. The dust of wheat chaff rises in the morning light, catching the first pale rays that now begin to colour the eastern sky, and you feel the fine particles settle upon your forearms where your sleeves are rolled back against the labour of observation. The river boats have come from the interior, from the fertile fields of the Nile Delta, where the annual flood has left its gift of dark silt, and their cargoes must now be transferred to the broader-hulled ships that will brave the open sea. The water before you changes from grey to green as the sun rises higher, a transformation so gradual that you cannot mark its beginning, only its becoming. The harbour basins created by the Hepte Stadium begin to glimmer with reflected light, and the great causeway itself emerges from shadow, its line of warehouses becoming distinct against the brightening sky. Ships from across the Mediterranean and beyond would anchor in these crowded waters. And even now, in this early hour, you can make out the dark shapes of vessels at rest, their masts swaying almost imperceptibly with the movement of the tide. Approximately 80% of Egyptian foreign trade was handled through this port, a figure that seems abstract, until you witness the volume of human effort required to move even a single morning's cargo from hold to hold, from boat to boat, from the river's bounty to the sea's highway. A spice merchant from southern Arabia has established himself near the corner where the quay meets the warehouse district, and you find yourself drawn toward his display by the sharp scents of cinnamon and pepper from his jars. His origins lie somewhere beyond the Red Sea, in lands of frankincense and myrrh that exist for his customers as half-mythical places, geographies of rumor and report rather than visited terrain. He speaks Greek with the accent of the Hadramaut, his vowels lengthened by desert distances, and he handles his wares with the particular gentleness of a man who knows that the value of what he sells lies as much in its journey as in its substance. Spices from Arabia and India pass through Alexandria's markets, and you understand now that this merchant stands at the terminus of a chain of transaction and transportation that extends across thousands of stadia, across monsoon winds and caravan routes, across the known world's most demanding geographies. The peppercorns gleam like dark jewels in their open basket, and the cinnamon bark curls in pale scrolls that will scent the kitchens of Roman households where no one has ever met a man from southern Arabia. The creak of wooden cranes loading cargo onto ships begins to punctuate the morning, a rhythmic complaint of timber and rope that will continue until the light fails. You watch one such crane lift a net of amphorae, the pottery swinging in careful arcs above the gap between quay and vessel, and you hear the overseer call numbers in Greek that are echoed by a voice below in the liquid consonants of another tongue. The market fills with the noise of half a dozen languages, Greek predominant but not exclusive, and you find yourself listening for the patterns beneath the words, the commerce of understanding that proceeds alongside the commerce of goods. The Ptolemies maintained a state monopoly on certain goods, including oil and papyrus, and you notice the official seals upon certain crates that pass, the stamped clay marking royal property, royal profit, royal control over the flows of value that make this harbour function. A government inspector moves through the crowd with the unhurried authority of a man whose salary does not depend upon haste, and you observe him pause beside a shipment of papyrus rolls bound for Rome. He lifts one roll to the light, unspooling its edge with a thumbnail, examining the weave of the reeds for quality and consistency. Papyrus from the Nile Delta was manufactured into writing material exported across the known world, and the inspector's careful assessment determines whether this particular batch will bear the seal of approval that permits its onward journey. The rolls lie in their protective cylinders, each one capable of holding the words of philosophers, the accounts of merchants, the correspondence of officials, the poems of lovers separated by the breadth of empire. You imagine the hands that will unroll them in distant libraries, the eyes that will trace the ink laid down by reed pens in rooms you will never enter, and the salt taste on your lips seems suddenly to connect you to those future readers. This harbour's products binding time as surely as geography. The water has become deep blue now, the sun risen high enough to burn away the morning's intermediary colours, and the harbour reveals itself in the fullness of its activity. The Hepte Stadium bustles with the movement of men and animals, its line of warehouses open now, their doors thrown back to reveal the accumulated wealth of continents. Egypt was famous throughout the Mediterranean for its great wealth, and you see this fame made material in the piles of grain sacks, the stacks of papyrus bundles, the aromatic chests of spice, the precious cargoes that will depart with the favorable winds. Customs duties on imports provided significant royal revenue, and you notice the collectors at their stations, their tablets and styluses recording the passage of value, the transformation of goods into the mathematical language of state accountancy. The kingdom was the longest surviving Alexandrian successor state, a fact that seems present in the very stones of this harbour, in the institutions that persist beyond the lives of their founders, in the routines of inspection and taxation and loading that proceed with the weight of established custom. You watch a ship captain negotiate for a cargo of Egyptian wheat to carry to Ostia, his gestures broad and emphatic, the merchants more contained, their Greek rapid and technical, full of terms for quality and quantity and payment that belong specifically to this world of maritime commerce. The captain's vessel waits at anchor, its hold empty, its crew at rest upon the deck, and you understand that his profit depends upon the speed of his crossing, the reliability of his arrival, the trust that Roman buyers will extend to grain that has traveled across such distances. Egyptian grain was essential to feed Rome's growing population, and this essentiality translates into the urgency you observe in the captain's movements, in the merchant's careful calculation, in the very atmosphere of possibility and risk that surrounds any venture upon the sea. The afternoon settles into the harbour with a slight lessening of the morning's intensity, and you find a place beneath the awning of a waterfront wine shop where you can observe without participating. The dust of wheat chaff still rises, but now it catches the golden light of declining day rather than the pale promise of dawn. The sharp sense of cinnamon and pepper from the spice merchants' jars have mellowed in the heat, mingling with the general odour of harbour commerce, of sweat and oil and fish, and the particular mustiness of papyrus exposed to humid air. The creak of wooden cranes loading cargo onto ships continues, though with a different rhythm now, the urgency of morning replaced by the steadiness of sustained labour, the knowledge that there remain only so many hours of useful light. A group of sailors passes your position, their voices loud with the particular camaraderie of men who have shared the confined space of a ship's deck, their Greek interlaced with words from other places, other harbours, other coasts where Alexandria's ships have made their landfall. The market fills still with the noise of half a dozen languages, though the proportion has shifted as the day progresses, certain merchants departing, others arriving, the harbour's population in constant turnover even as its institutions remain fixed. You taste salt on your lips from harbour spray that now carries a different quality, the afternoon wind stirring the water into small waves that break against the quay with sounds like distant applause. The changing colours of the water now reverse themselves, the deep blue softening toward turquoise, toward the muted tones of evening. The Hepte Stadium casts a long shadow across the western basin, and the warehouses begin to close their doors, their transactions completed, their goods either transferred or stored against tomorrow's continuation. Alexandria possessed the largest seaport in Egypt, and you have witnessed only a single day of its operation, a fragment of the continuous flow that moves through this place, the unending exchange that connects the Nile's valley to the Mediterranean circle, that binds the production of Egyptian fields to the consumption of Roman tables, the harvests of Arabian highlands to the kitchens of distant cities. A ship captain negotiates still, though now for departure rather than cargo, for the harbour master's permission to sail, for the pilot who will guide his vessel through the channel between the breakwaters. The kingdom was the longest surviving Alexandrian successor state, and its longevity seems embodied in this persistence of routine, in the continuity of harbour life that has outlasted individual rulers, individual ships, individual fortunes made and lost upon these waters. The spice merchant from southern Arabia packs his remaining wares into leather bags, their sharp sense of cinnamon and pepper momentarily intensified by the disturbance. His day's trade has been sufficient, his half-mythical origins sufficient guarantee of authenticity for customers who will never verify the provenance of what they have purchased. He catches your eye as he secures his last bundle, and something in his expression acknowledges the shared condition of those who observe without fully belonging, who move through the world's markets without being claimed by any single one. The government inspector completes his final examination, his tablet filled with the day's notations, his seal applied to the last of the approved shipments. The day ends with the market closing, the warehouses barred, the harbour settling into evening calm. The creak of wooden cranes loading cargo onto ships has ceased, replaced by the gentler sounds of rigging settling, of hulls creaking as they adjust to changing tides, of voices lowered in the relief of labour concluded. The dust of wheat chaff no longer rises in the morning light, but settles upon the quay, upon the sacks that remain, upon the accumulated debris of a day's commerce that will be swept away before tomorrow's beginning. The changing colours of the water complete their cycle, the deep blue darkening toward indigo, toward the black that will merge with the night sky, and render the harbour a space of sound, rather than sight, of the slap of water against hulls, of distant voices from ships preparing for departure or arrival, of the eternal movement of a port that never truly sleeps. Ships from across the Mediterranean and beyond anchored in the crowded waters, and you imagine them now as points of stillness upon the darkened surface, their lamps small stars reflected in the greater darkness below, their crews resting or gambling or planning the next day's negotiations in the languages that have filled this place since first light. The Hepte Stadium becomes a line of darkness against the lesser darkness of the water, its warehouses now sealed, its daytime traffic stilled to the occasional passage of watchmen or lovers or those who move through cities at night, because the day's commerce has left them too restless for sleep. The harbour basins created by this great causeway lie quiet, their division into the great harbour and the Eunostos, or harbour of safe return, now merely a matter of navigational knowledge rather than visible geography, the distinction between the two maintained in the memories of pilots and the records of harbour officials rather than in any immediate perception. The ship captain who negotiated for his cargo of wheat will be upon the open sea by now, or perhaps still working through the harbour's entrance, his pilot guiding him past the Pharos with its great fire that will become visible as true night descends. What you perceive is the older industrialism, the human-powered cranes, the animal-drawn carts, the combustion of wood and dried, dung that heats the furnaces where glass is worked and metal shaped, the manufacturing that proceeds in workshops behind the harbour front, hidden from your observation, but present in the sounds that carry across the evening, the rhythmic hammering, the occasional flare of light from an opened furnace door. You remain standing at the harbour as the last light fails, your position unchanged since the grey of dawn, your witnessing of this single day now complete in its arc from darkness through light to darkness again. The salt taste on your lips from harbour spray has become familiar, almost unnoticed, a condition of presence in this place rather than a sensation to be remarked. Around you, the harbour settles into the deeper calm that precedes the next day's renewal, the next cycle of loading and inspection and negotiation and departure that will repeat the patterns you have observed, that have repeated across years and decades, and the generations of those whose lives are bound to this water's edge. The great harbour and the Eunostos, or harbour of safe return, exist now as names in the darkness, as institutional memories, as the accumulated knowledge of those who navigate by stars and landmarks and the feel of currents against their hulls. The Hepte Stadium stretches invisible, its 7 stadia a passage for those who know it, a barrier for those who do not, the causeway that created the harbour basins now creating in its turn the conditions of silence and separation, the mainland's distance from the island's isolation. the human connection that enables both commerce and the quiet of concluded labor. You will carry this day with you as you depart, the dust of wheat chaff upon your clothing, the sharp sense of cinnamon and pepper in your memory, the creak of wooden cranes, a sound that will recur unexpectedly in other contexts, other harbors, other moments of transition between land and sea. The changing colors of the water from gray to green to deep blue, as the sun rises higher, have marked your passage through this single day. And now the reversal of that progression, the darkening toward night, marks its completion. The royal quarter of Alexandria rises from the eastern harbor in a procession of limestone terraces and colonnaded walkways, each level stepping back from the water as if the land itself were offering its architecture to the sea. You are standing now at the base of the palace complex, where the morning light strikes the harbor's surface and scatters into countless small reflections that dance against the lower walls. The cool of thick palace walls against the afternoon heat has not yet gathered its full strength, for the sun has only begun its slow climb toward zenith, and the stone retains something of the night's comparative freshness. Around you, the merchants are unloading their cargoes from vessels that have made the crossing from Cyprus, from Rhodes, from the Syrian coast, their voices carrying across the water in the cadences of half a dozen Mediterranean tongues. The distant splash of oars from the royal barge on the harbor marks the passage of some official vessel making its measured way toward the private docks, where only the palace's own ships may moor. Cleopatra VII moves through the palace corridors, her footsteps silent on mosaic floors that depict the triumphs of her forebears in tiny tesserae of lapis and gold. She is the daughter of Ptolemy XII, that monarch whose nickname Auletes marked him as the flute player, a title that spoke of his devotion to the arts and to the cult of the god Dionysos. That god, whom the Egyptians had long known as Osiris, held particular sway over the Ptolemaic imagination, and Ptolemy XII bore the epithet Neos Dionysos, proclaiming himself the living embodiment of divine renewal. The heavy scent of roses in the courtyard garden drifts through the open arches, a Ptolemaic emblem that has adorned this dynasty's coinage and ceremony for generations, its sweetness mingling with the sharper salt of the harbor beyond. You are walking now beneath a peristyle where the morning shadows still linger, the columns casting long stripes across the polished floor that seem to point toward the sea. Ptolemy XII was driven from his throne in 58 BCE and went to Rome, that distant city whose power already cast its shadow across the affairs of every Eastern kingdom. He spent years in the capital of the Republic, pleading and bargaining for the restoration of his authority, learning perhaps more than he wished of how Roman senators understood the nature of kingship. The rustle of silk, as the queen moves, imported at great cost from the east, whispers from somewhere ahead in the corridor, a sound like dry leaves or the passage of some rare bird through reeds. He was reinstated with Roman help in 55 BCE, returning to Alexandria with the knowledge that his throne rested upon the shifting favors of distant men who spoke a language of law and conquest, foreign to the ceremonial traditions of the Nile. The bitter taste of the local wine, watered for the evening meal, awaits in vessels already being prepared in the palace kitchens. For even in the morning the household staff moves with the unhurried precision of those who serve a court where every gesture carries weight. Cleopatra VII pauses at a window overlooking the harbor, watching Roman ships at anchor where the masts of Republican galleys rise like a forest stripped of leaves. She has ruled since 51 BCE, the year of her father's death, inheriting a kingdom that had known Ptolemaic governance for almost 3 centuries, a span that encompassed the rise and fall of greater empires than her own. You are standing beside her at this window, though she does not acknowledge your presence, her attention fixed upon the vessels that represent both threat and possibility, the instruments of a power she must accommodate or redirect. She was driven from Alexandria in 48 BCE by the ministers of her younger brother Ptolemy the 13th. That event still recent enough to shape the caution with which she moves through rooms where allegiance may shift with the harbour winds. The heavy scent of roses in the courtyard garden rises again, carried on air that has begun to warm toward the fullness of midday. The flowers planted in soil brought by barge from the delta, tended by gardeners who have never known any master but her family. Cleopatra's famous encounter with Julius Caesar occurred in 48 BCE when she had herself smuggled into the palace, rolled in a carpet or concealed in a linen sack, according to the varying accounts, emerging into the presence of the Roman general with the composure of one who had calculated every risk and found it acceptable. The rustle of silk, as the queen moves, marks her departure from the window, her silhouette passing through bands of light and shadow as she continues along the corridor. The palace complex, the library, and the museum together compose the heart of this royal quarter, each institution speaking to a different aspect of Ptolemaic ambition. You are walking now through a passage that connects the residential wings to the administrative chambers, where clerks are already at work upon the documents that will govern the day's transactions across Egypt's vast agricultural expanse. In the audience chamber, she receives a delegation in their own language, switching effortlessly from the Greek of her court to the Aramaic of the Jewish merchants, to the Latin of the Roman factor, to the Egyptian that she has made her own. She is known to have spoken 9 languages according to Plutarch, that biographer who would write of her long after this moment, capturing something of her brilliance in phrases that would outlast the marble of this very room. You are standing among the assembled courtiers now, watching her face as it modulates to each new tongue, the slight adjustments of posture and expression that accompany each transition, as if she were donning and doffing invisible garments tailored to each people. The heavy scent of roses in the courtyard garden seems to have followed her here, or perhaps it is the memory of scent, the way certain perfumes cling to the imagination long after their physical presence has dispersed. She was the first Ptolemaic ruler to learn the Egyptian language, breaking with 3 centuries of her dynasty's custom, that Greek-speaking dynasty that had governed from Memphis, and then from Alexandria, without ever fully descending into the idiom of their subjects. The rustle of silk, as the queen moves, accompanies her gesture of dismissal. The audience concluded with the efficiency of one who has extracted what she required and offered what she chose to concede. The Ptolemies had ruled Egypt for almost 3 centuries, and in that time they had built a system of power that mingled Macedonian military organization with pharaonic ceremonial Greek philosophical inquiry, with Egyptian priestly tradition, creating a hybrid that had sustained itself through the convulsions of the wider Hellenistic world. You are moving now through antechambers where the light falls more dimly, where the frescoes of conquered peoples and triumphant deities fade into the respectful obscurity of spaces not intended for the public gaze. Evening finds her in the library, reading perhaps a text in Egyptian hieroglyphs she has taught herself, the characters that had remained the exclusive preserve of priests now yielding their secrets to her determined study. You are standing in the reading room where the scrolls are stored in pigeonholes of cedar, each cylinder bearing its identifying tag in the hand of some long-dead cataloguer who served the scholarly ambitions of earlier Ptolemies. The heavy scent of roses in the courtyard garden has intensified with the evening's stillness, the flowers releasing their perfume more generously as the temperature drops, as if the darkness were a signal for some botanical generosity. She later formed an alliance and had children with Mark Antony, that Roman commander who would share her fate and her posterity, their union producing twins and a son who would carry the hopes of a dynasty into the narrowing possibilities of the late Republic. The rustle of silk, as the queen moves, is quieter here in the library, where the acoustics of many scrolls and attentive readers demand a certain muffling of gesture, a restraint upon the body's natural noises. You are sitting now upon a bench near the window, where the last light of day enters at an angle that illuminates the papyrus in her hands, the hieroglyphs seeming to glow with their own obscure significance, their bird shapes and seated figures and rippling waterlines arranged in columns that read from right to left in the manner of the ancient scribes. A messenger arrives with news from Rome, the Republic's politics ever more intrusive, his footsteps hurried in the corridor outside, his breathing audible before his voice. You are watching her face as she receives the dispatch, the slight tightening around the eyes that speaks of intelligence received and instantly weighed, of calculations made in the interval between breaths. The heavy scent of roses in the courtyard garden persists, but it has been joined now by the sharper fragrance of evening-opening jasmine, the palace's horticultural arrangements designed to provide continuous olfactory pleasure through the hours of darkness. The Battle of Actium in 31 BCE marked the beginning of the end for her rule, though that defeat still lies ahead in the future that this messenger's dispatch perhaps anticipates or confirms. You are following now as she moves toward her private quarters, the corridors narrowing, the decorations shifting from public grandeur to the more intimate iconography of dynastic family, of Ptolemy the 12th Auletes and his children, of the lineage that stretches back to the companion of Alexander who first claimed Egypt as his portion. She retires to quarters that have housed 3 centuries of her dynasty, knowing she may be the last, the rooms where generations of her forebears have slept and waked and governed and died. The cool of thick palace walls against the afternoon heat, against the evening's moderation, against the night's eventual chill, surrounds her as it has surrounded them, the stone indifferent to the particular identity of the bodies it shelters. You are standing at the threshold now, not crossing into the innermost chamber, for there are limits even to imagined presence, boundaries that courtesy and historical probability alike suggest should be observed. The heavy scent of roses in the courtyard garden reaches its nocturnal intensity, the flowers releasing their accumulated sweetness into air that has grown still enough to carry it through open windows, into dreams, into the hours of darkness that precede another Alexandrian dawn. She died in 30 BCE, the precise circumstances still debated, the asp or the poisoned pin or some other instrument of self-determined ending, her death coinciding with the extinction of the independent Egypt she had sought to preserve. The rustle of silk, as the queen moves, has fallen silent now, the garments laid aside, the body that wore them become another kind of text, another subject for the historians who would reconstruct these years from fragments and partisan accounts. With her death, Egypt fell to Rome and became a Roman province. The 3 centuries of Ptolemaic rule concluded, the royal quarter passing into other hands, other purposes, the library and the museum continuing for time before their own eventual dissolution. You are standing now at the harbour's edge, where the night has fully descended upon the eastern water, the stars reflected in the gentle movement of a sea that receives all rivers, all histories, all endings. The rustle of silk as the queen moves has entered the realm of echo, of historical imagination, of the sounds we make in our minds when we attempt to inhabit moments that have completed their passage. You are lying down now, or standing still, or moving slowly through spaces that have lost their distinct boundaries, the harbour and the palace and the library and the garden merging into a continuous terrain of half-recognized forms. The heavy scent of roses lingers somewhere beyond the courtyard wall, though you are standing now at the harbour at dawn, or what passes for dawn in a city that has forgotten how to sleep through the night. The first grey of dawn spreads across the eastern water, indifferent to who rules the city below, and you feel the salt wind move across your face as it has moved across this harbour for 3 centuries of Ptolemaic kings. Alexandria, the city that Ptolemy I had made his capital after Alexander's death, spreads around you in its morning grey, its streets already stirring with the commerce that will outlast the dynasty that built them. The harbour of sleep that receives all vessels has released you into this half-light, this interval between the old governance and whatever arrives with the next tide. Roman soldiers stand watch on captured vessels in the middle harbour, their silhouettes dark against the pale water, their presence no longer the novelty it was when Octavian's fleet first entered these waters after the Battle of Actium in 31 BCE. Around you, merchants unload their cargoes with the mechanical patience of men who have learned to continue regardless of who claims tribute from their profits. The Ptolemaic kingdom had lasted from 305 to 30 BCE, nearly 3 centuries of dominion that began when Ptolemy I took the royal title after serving as satrap from 323 BCE, and now that long arc approaches its final hours. The particular silence of a city waiting for news it already knows settles over the keys like a mist that will not lift, a silence in which every footstep sounds deliberate, every voice hushed, as if the words themselves might hasten what approaches. The smell of burning from distant fires drifts across the water, perhaps celebration, perhaps destruction, and you cannot tell which, nor can the soldiers who turn their faces toward the shore with the same unreadable expressions they have worn since Egypt became a Roman province in their minds long before the formal proclamation. The same salt wind that has blown across this harbour for 3 centuries carries ash and incense in equal measure, moving across your face with a persistence that owes nothing to human affairs. Alexandria continued as an important city under Roman rule, as it had already continued through Persian occupation and Greek liberation and Ptolemaic ambition. The library and museum persisting after the change of regime as institutions too valuable to disturb even by conquerors who claim to despise the culture they inherited. You are walking now along the marble embankment that Ptolemy II had extended to accommodate the increasing volume of trade, your footsteps echoing against stone that has known the tread of embassies from every coast of the Mediterranean. The scholars are already negotiating their own accommodations with the new power, even as the old power prepares its final statement in the palace beyond the walls. The unchanging stars above the lighthouse, Greek constellations named by forgotten poets, fade slowly into the brightening sky, and you find yourself counting them as you walk, as if the number might correspond to something you need to remember about the nature of endings. The Pharos lighthouse continued to operate for centuries after the fall of the Ptolemies, and even now its keeper tends his fire as he has every night for generations of his family, the flame rising through the morning air with a steadiness that suggests contempt for human uncertainty. In the palace, the last preparations are made for what history will record as a tragic ending, though you are not there to witness them, standing instead at the harbour at dawn, where the ordinary life of the city provides its own commentary on extraordinary events. The heavy scent of roses reaches you again, carried on a shift in the wind from some garden behind the seawall, and you remember that this fragrance has marked Ptolemaic ceremony since the first of that name established his court in the Egyptian style. Cleopatra had sought Roman alliance first with Caesar, then with Antony, and now that double wager would be called, the stakes collected, the table cleared for a different game with different rules and different players who spoke Latin, where Greek had governed the conversation of power. The cold air moves across your face, and you pull your cloak more closely around your shoulders, a gesture of protection that feels suddenly archaic, belonging to a world in which individuals might still believe their small preparations mattered against the momentum of empires. The scholar in the museum closes a text, wondering if his salary will continue under the new order, and you imagine him sitting in the portico where generations of his predecessors had argued the nature of the cosmos, while slaves copied manuscripts in the rooms below. The library and museum persisted after the change of regime, as you know, as he does not yet know with the certainty that only hindsight provides, and his worry is both justified and unnecessary, the particular anxiety of a man who has defined himself through an institution that will survive him without acknowledging his contribution. Around you, the merchants continue unloading their cargoes, their movements practiced and unhurried, and you notice how the rhythm of their labor resembles the rhythm of breathing, the interval between thoughts. The long descent into whatever harbor receives the vessels of our intentions when the wind changes and the old destinations cease to be possible. The fire of the Pharos burns on, a beacon that has outlasted the kingdom it served, and you are standing at the harbor at dawn, watching its smoke rise through the morning light as it has risen through 3 centuries of Ptolemaic evenings and will rise through centuries more of Roman afternoons. Egypt became a Roman province in 30 BCE, a date that will be memorized by schoolboys in another language. Another empire, another millennium, and the lighthouse keeper tends his fire with the same movements his grandfather used, his grandfather's grandfather, back to the first generation that Ptolemy I had employed when he secured Egypt as his domain after Alexander's death. The smell of burning from distant fires comes again, stronger now, and you turn toward the palace quarter where the final scenes of this long drama are being prepared with the meticulous attention to detail that characterized Ptolemaic administration even in its dissolution. The death of Cleopatra VII and Mark Antony will be recorded by historians who were not present, interpreted by poets who never knew the particular quality of this light, this wind, this silence that precedes the announcement that changes everything while changing nothing in the immediate experience of those who must continue to eat and sleep and tend their fires. The same salt wind carries now the sound of distant voices, perhaps lamentation, perhaps the ordinary business of a palace preparing for transition, and you cannot distinguish between them, nor does your presence at the harbor require that you do so. The first grey of dawn has given way to a morning brightness that reveals the Roman soldiers more clearly, their armor dulled by salt, their faces young and remote from the history they are enforcing. Octavian's victory left no alternative power in the Mediterranean, and these men represent the finality of that victory, the translation of naval battle into administrative fact, of decisive combat into the dull routine of occupation. The cold air moves across your face with a freshness that suggests the wind has shifted, carrying now from the open sea rather than the land, and you taste the change as a subtle alteration in the salt upon your lips, the particular mineral composition of a body of water that has witnessed the rise and fall of more empires than any single lifetime could comprehend. Around you, the merchants unload their cargoes with increasing activity as the harbor awakens to another day of commerce that will continue regardless of whose image appears on the coinage, whose name heads the official correspondence. The Ptolemaic kingdom had dominated the eastern Mediterranean for nearly 3 centuries, longer than any other successor state to Alexander's empire, precisely because it had learned to adapt, to accommodate, to present itself as indispensable to larger powers whose protection it purchased with grain and gold and strategic positioning. Rome's involvement in Egyptian affairs had grown steadily through the last century of Ptolemaic rule, and Ptolemy XII had depended on Roman support for his throne, a dependency that his daughter inherited and extended through her alliances with Caesar, and then with Antony, each relationship more costly and ultimately more fatal than the last. The unchanging stars above the lighthouse have vanished into the morning blue, though you remember their positions, the Greek constellations named by forgotten poets who had imagined their own immortality in verses, now preserved only through the copying efforts of men like the scholar in the museum. The creative energy of the Hellenistic kingdoms was extinguished not through violence, but through the slower process of becoming unnecessary, of being absorbed into a larger project that had no particular use for the distinctive achievements of its predecessors. You are walking again along the embankment, and your shadow falls across stones that have known the shadows of Ptolemaic princes and Roman ambassadors and nameless workers who maintained the harbour through every change of master. The fire of the Pharos burns on, and you find yourself measuring your pace to the rhythm of its keeper's movements, the regular addition of fuel, the adjustment of the mirror that concentrates the light for distant vessels. His family has served this function since before the present queen was born, since before her father depended on Roman support, since before the steady growth of Rome's involvement in Egyptian affairs made this ending inevitable. The smell of burning from distant fires persists, and you notice that it carries now a different quality, something sharper that suggests not celebration, but the deliberate destruction of materials that must not fall into other hands. The heavy scent of roses reaches you once more, fainter now, dissolving into the general harbour smells of fish and rope, and the tar that preserves wooden hulls against the destructive work of salt and water. The cold air moves across your face with a warmth that surprises you, the first indication of a day that will be hot, that will make the Roman soldiers uncomfortable in their armour, that will continue the ancient Egyptian rhythm of climate that the Ptolemies had adopted and that the Romans would adopt in their turn. The first grey of dawn, indifferent to who rules the city below, has completed its transformation into ordinary morning, and you feel the harbour settling into routines that will persist, that have persisted, that will outlast your presence here, as they outlasted the presence of Ptolemy the First when he initially ruled as satrap from 323 BCE. The same salt wind carries now the sound of bells from the lighthouse, a signal to vessels that the channel remains open, that commerce continues, that the fire burns as it has burned and will burn. Yet the creative energy of the Hellenistic kingdoms was extinguished, not in a moment, but through the gradual realization that the questions they had pursued no longer required their particular answers, that the Roman peace would generate its own forms of inquiry and expression, different in kind, if not necessarily lesser in achievement. Around you, the merchants unload their cargoes with the relaxed efficiency of men who have completed the most demanding portion of their morning labor and may now settle into the longer rhythm of the day. You find yourself calculating the span of the Pharos, the generations of keepers, the tons of fuel consumed in the service of a navigation that would eventually find other guides, other beacons, other forms of orientation that required no human hand to maintain. Its smoke rises through the morning air in a column that seems to connect the working harbour to the unchanging stars above the lighthouse, Greek constellations, named by forgotten poets who had imagined their verses as permanent as the patterns they described. The cold air moves across your face, and you realize that you have been standing motionless for some time, caught in the contemplation of a transition that your presence here can only witness, cannot alter or accelerate or mourn in any way that history would record. Egypt's grain was vital to Rome's food supply, and this economic importance, alongside its philosophical and artistic legacies, ensured the province's significance in the imperial system that would replace the kingdom. The Roman province of Aegyptus was ruled by an equestrian prefect, a detail that you recall from your reading, a detail that will matter to the administrators who arrive with the next fleet, and that matters already to the harbour officials who prepare their accounts in the new format required by the new governance. You are walking again, your footsteps loud in your own ears against the marble, and you pass the place where Roman soldiers stand watch on captured vessels, their vigilance now routine, their presence accepted by the merchants who unload their cargoes around the hulls that once carried Ptolemaic ambitions across the same waters. The smell of burning from distant fires has diminished to the edge of perception, and you find yourself searching for it, nostrils wide, as if the absence required confirmation, as if the end of a signal were itself a signal of something further, something that lies beyond the range of present sensing. You imagine the moments of decision in the palace, the weighing of options that were never really options, the final acceptance of a narrative that would be written by others, and for purposes that the protagonist could not control. The heavy scent of roses comes once more, carried on a breeze that seems to originate from nowhere, to have no direction, to exist purely as sensation without meteorological cause. The morning is now well advanced, the sun risen clear of the horizon and beginning its daily work of heating the stones where you stand, where others have stood, where others will stand when the Roman province of Egyptus has itself become history, when another power, another language, another set of constellations names the sky above the lighthouse. The same salt wind carries your thought outward, dissolves it into the general circulation of air and water that recognizes no political boundary, no historical period, no distinction between the living and the dead, except what the living themselves impose. You find yourself counting the rhythms of the Pharos burning, the intervals between the keeper's interventions, the steady consumption of wood that represents a commitment to continuity more profound than any declaration or treaty or change of official title. His tending is a form of prayer, a meditation on persistence that requires no theological formulation, no philosophical justification, only the repeated gesture, the accumulated skill, the trust that the fire will be maintained, because it has always been maintained, because the harbour requires it, because the vessels that depend upon it are themselves engaged in the same project of continuation against the entropy that claims all fires eventually. The unchanging stars above the lighthouse are now invisible, the sky a deepening blue that promises the full brightness of midday. But you remember their positions, the Greek constellations named by forgotten poets, and you carry them within your own darkness, your own interval between thoughts, your own long descent into the harbour of sleep that receives all vessels, all journeys, all the accumulated wakefulness of the day now passing into another country, another governance, another possibility of rest. The first grey of dawn has given way to this ordinary morning, and you feel the indifference as a kind of comfort, a release from the obligation to respond, to choose, to declare allegiance to any power that will itself pass as the Ptolemies have passed, as the Romans will pass, as all human arrangements pass into the keeping of the same salt wind that moves across your face, now with a gentleness that suggests evening approaching, though the day is still young, though the harbour still bustles, though the fire still burns. Around you, the merchants unload their cargoes with the slowing movements of men approaching a midday pause, and you notice how their labour has transformed the quay, the piles of goods arranged in the patterns of commerce that will be repeated, varied, continued regardless of whose tax collectors assess the value, whose currency denominates the transactions. Alexandria continued as an important city under Roman rule, and these continuities are visible in the very stones where you stand, the worn marble smoothed by generations of feet, the iron rings where vessels have been moored through every change of tide and government. The cold air moves across your face with a softness that suggests the harbour's own breathing, its own interval between the inhalation of morning and the exhalation of evening, its own long descent into the darkness where the Pharos fire will become visible again, will resume its ancient function of guiding what arrives from the unknown toward the shelter of the known. You take comfort in the persistence of the library and museum, in the evidence that human achievement can outlast the political structures that enable it, can find new patrons, new languages, new forms of continuation that preserve what matters against what merely changes. The heavy scent of roses has gone now, replaced by the ordinary harbour smells, and you do not mourn its passing, recognizing in its disappearance the same law that governs all sensory experience, all presence, all the moments of intensity that constitute a life, and that cannot be held except in memory, in the interval between thoughts, in the long descent that receives all vessels, all journeys, all the accumulated wakefulness of the day. The fire of the Pharos burns on, and you are standing at the harbour in the full morning now, the sun high enough to warm the stones where you stand, to cast short shadows that suggest the approach of noon, of another midpoint, another turning point in the daily cycle that continues regardless of historical drama. You imagine the keeper in the chamber at the top of the tower, the heat of his responsibility, the concentration required to maintain what must be maintained against the winds that would extinguish, against the rains that would drown, against the general tendency of things to fall apart, to cool, to return to the chaos from which human effort temporarily rescues them. The smell of burning from distant fires has gone entirely now, absorbed into the general atmosphere, indistinguishable from the harbour's own contributions of smoke and steam and the evaporating residues of fish and tar and human labour. You are standing at the harbour in the full day, and yet some part of you remains in that earlier light, that first grey of dawn, indifferent to who rules the city below, that moved you without your volition into this scene, this witnessing, this participation in an ending that is also a beginning, a fall that is also a continuation, a death that is also the condition of whatever life follows. The same salt wind carries now the sound of a bell from the lighthouse, a signal whose meaning you do not know, whose purpose you can only guess, but whose regularity suggests order, suggests persistence, suggests the possibility of meaning even in a world where kingdoms fall and beacons burn and scholars wonder if their salaries will continue under the new order that is always arriving, always new, always the same. The cold air moves across your face one final time, a reminder of the dawn that has passed, the interval that has closed, the harbour of sleep that receives all vessels, all journeys, all the accumulated wakefulness of the day now passing into another country, another governance, another possibility of rest. Around you, the merchants unload their cargoes with the steady rhythm of men who know their work, who will continue their work, whose work will continue them in turn through the transformations that they do not choose, but that they survive, that they adapt to, that they make their own through the simple fact of continuing.